This is the Parents Who Think debate show, and today is episode 3 and the close of our Should Schools Teach About Gender Identity and Sexual Orientation debate. If this is your first time finding your way to Parents Who Think, welcome. Regular listeners would probably tell you to go listen to episodes 1 and 2 of the debate. Now, obviously, that'll give you the full experience. You'd meet the 3 PWT parents properly and hear about their opinions on this topic. Meantime, I'll try to sum things up in one sentence for you. I can't make it a snappy one, a kind of short one, as we'll miss all the pieces if we do that, so here goes. Promote teaching beyond binaries and model diversity to challenge heteronormativity, or rely on parental guidance for when children inquire. Wow, that was a mouthful, wasn't it? I'm Danusha Malina-Derben. I'm in conversation with 3 parents, one with what she thinks is a predictable opinion, and the other 2 with progressive opinions about this debate topic. They've shared why they believe schools should teach about gender identity and sexual orientation, or not. They've also shared why school isn't an appropriate space for this teaching and the reasons why it is. It's a complex picture, it really is. Now, my guests all care for the fair treatment of human beings. They want their children to respect others, but they disagree about this being the context for teaching about gender identity and sexual orientation. Now, this is school. The foregrounding of these topics in school curriculum time concerns Amy. She questions why these protected characteristics matter more than other ones. Virginia wants training on gender identity and sexual orientation to matter more than bolt-on sessions. She wants schools to build truly inclusive cultures in everything they do. Now, Jane wants gender questioning kids to find safety at school because she argues they might not always find this at home with binary-minded parents. PWT debate parents want kids to be safeguarded. Playground dynamics are high on their minds. They don't agree about the ways to bring awareness of gender identity and sexual orientation to their children, but they do want everyone to be free from bullying and harm. It's worth repeating, this debate is not about the rightness of gender identity explorations or sexual orientation beyond heterosexuality. It's about whether schools should be teaching about these. It's the school context that's in question. Here's a quick recap from Amy, Virginia, and Jane from last episode. Then we'll move on to hear how these guests get into the if this, then that segment, and onto the one habit they have because of their opinions. Now, I close out this debate by spilling the tea on whether I think schools should teach about gender identity and sexual orientation. Yep, I'll be showing up as the flawed, disagreeable person I can be, whether you chime with or disagree with my opinions. Parents Who Think is a place for scrappy-edged, imperfect humans and our contrasting and contradictory views on tough topics. Ooh, and about that, our next debate is on should smacking be banned in England and Northern Ireland. Let's get to that recap.
School should be somewhere where it is safe, where you feel safe, where you are, protected, where you're learning. And for me, this coming into the classroom in such a heated way then doesn't stay in the classroom. It spills out into the playground and into interactions between children.
And I sometimes wonder about how much richer my life would have been if I had the tools and the conversation and the space and the knowledge that I have now when I was growing up. And it's something I'm determined to give to my kids, and I would love every kid to have.
Ignoring, resisting the fact that your child is LGBT or trans significantly increases the risk that they're going to take their own lives. And if it's not your child, would you want to do that to someone else's child?
And In episode 1 and 2, we heard how Jane is raising neurodiverse, trans and non-binary children. Virginia's bisexuality is an identity she now claims proudly. Remember, these are partial pieces in the picture of why they both argue that schools should teach about gender identity and sexual orientation. Amy is both keen to make sure women's life stages are not unacknowledged, while also wanting to retain control over what's delivered to her children and by whom. This includes the context in which her children learn about this topic. Again, this is such a simplified explainer. Now, all my guests offer layered reasons for their opinions. These include narratives from their childhoods, their school life, families, and many other structural variables, as we've heard, as they've shared in the last 2 episodes. Also, this is an incomplete way of describing where they're coming from. I urge us to be gentle as we listen to how others see things. Perhaps we can table anticipated outrage. How about that? Now, the next segment is crucial because we can skip over it or not even consider it as something to consider. In PWT, we call it if this, then that, because in any strong belief we hold, we have a picture or idea of what the consequences are of allowing something to be or to happen. For instance, if we let our 3-year-old hit other children, they may get hit back or find it difficult to make friends. Our behaviour has impacts. Now that this is hitting other kids and that is finding it hard to have friends or getting hit back. The essence of this segment is about the consequences of actions, beliefs or decisions. I ask my guests, if this, then that, about schools teaching about gender identity and sexual orientation. If gender identity and sexual orientation is not taught in schools, what's the that?
Well, a lot of people will still stigmatize sexual orientation, will not be compassionate with people that deviate from those strict boxes. They will miss out on opportunities and they will hold a lot of either internalized doubts and questions or external ones and just become maybe unconsciously or just bullies and will be part of somebody's problem.
I ought to have asked Virginia what she meant by somebody's problem. I didn't. Now, I'm guessing she means if schools don't teach about gender identity and sexual orientation, then some people will potentially hold judgmental, gender critical or transphobic views. And for gender questioning or LGBT people, this can translate into being physically assaulted or abused, harassed, ostracised and misgendered, which is all, need I say this, harmful. Incorporating discussions about gender identity and sexual orientation into various subjects such as history, literature, and social studies can mean schools help students understand the social and cultural context of LGBTQ+ experiences. I hope this is a flavour of what Virginia was driving at. Now let's have Jane sock it to us.
It's huge discrimination levels that already exist and are going to get worse. If it's pushed in that way, they're going to get worse. Well, you think that it might not be an issue if your child is not part of the LGBT community, but what if you're the brother of an LGBT child and your brother is being bullied? What if your brother ends up committing suicide? Sorry, not dying by suicide. Committing suicide is the wrong terminology again. You know, what if you're the parent? What if you're the grandparent? What if you're the partner? This debate doesn't only concern the LGBT humans. It's everybody who is related to them or who loves them, who is in contact with them. So there's not really any big pockets of society that can pretend that it doesn't affect them. And it's a question of human rights at the end of the day.
By not teaching this, what will that do for human rights for our children?
Well, first, that can be a barrier to education, because if schools are not safe for LGBT children, then they will not go into schools. They will drop out.
Arguably, schools aren't safe for children. There are children sat at home today feeling safer at home than they were at school.
I would say any child who comes from a marginalized group, so say LGBT, say neurodiverse, is not necessarily safe anyway. But it is our duty to make it safer for every human being to feel safe in schools, in hospitals, in public places, isn't it? Just because they're a minority or you might not be affected, do you think you don't have to care? I don't think so. I think you have to care.
What happens if we don't care?
Well, there's this poem that was written by a German person, and I can't remember exactly how it goes, but it says something like, first they came for the Jews and nobody said anything, and then they came for the gays and nobody said anything. Do you know what I mean? And then they came for, so there's going to be an erosion of human rights, but for governments who are actually not that keen on human rights, and they exist, I want to say, we live in the complacent place of thinking that democracy is never in danger. And that is not true. So if we allow these human rights to be eroded for minorities we don't care about, it's almost like a fire that you don't try to stop. It's going to burn the whole forest eventually. Because if people don't care about human rights at a government level, then they're going to push and push and push and go as far as the resistance. If there's no resistance, that's what happened in Germany.
Jane quotes Pastor Martin Neumoller's famous short poem called First They Came. It goes like this. First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out, because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me.
I think it's okay for kids to question their gender identity and then decide. And then they explore their sexual orientation and ask themselves questions. And it doesn't have to be like, well, you've said these once and that's forever and that's who you are. And it's like, well, things can be fluid and nuanced and complex. And there has to be a space for everybody to explore those things and be allowed to ask themselves questions and to try things and to see what feels home and to feel what feels truth to themselves.
Virginia and Jane identify schools as potential safe spaces for questioning and exploring. In their if this then that, not teaching about gender identity and sexual orientation in these contexts might take away one of the only places where kids can experiment. But here's Amy's take.
So if we spent time in schools teaching children around gender identity and sexual orientation, then we would not have as much time in the curriculum to teach them other life skills that I believe would help them thrive more as adults, such as learning how to use money, learning how to breathe properly, emotional regulation.
Earlier, you said you want this in your control as a parent. You believe it's in the child's best interests and from the curriculum perspective, time and life skills interest to actually keep it out of schools and give it to parents.
That is something I would want. I appreciate that's individual, but I put a lot of thought into one of the things is a joy to me about being a mother, which I hadn't thought about until I was one, was that being a mother makes me look at my own belief systems and thoughts and really sift out what I've inherited from other people and what I actually believe and what I want to pass on. So for me, having control about what my children are learning and it's presented in a way that I am happy with, comfortable with, have thought through is really important. I appreciate not every parent will think like that.
Amy would like control over what her children are learning, and her focus goes wider.
But that also applies, by the way, to the people writing the curriculum, to the people teaching the curriculum, to teachers who, have been told they have to do this and don't want to, who are presenting this potentially sensitive information to our children. So actually, that's also a nuance in this is, yes, the concept is, shall we teach it at schools, yes or no? But there's the process and the practicalities of how that would work. Who writes the curriculum? Who's chosen what's in it? whose voices have been told, how are people trained up in it, how are teachers going to present it. They're all different steps of the practical application of the policy that I think, need thinking through.
How much influence would you want to have as a parent if that were put in place for your two children?
Well, the reality is, how much influence can you have? Like I said, I do have friends locally whose schools are teaching this, some of whom who have asked their children to be removed from the classroom while this happens. And it puts a lot of pressure on a parent, because you either allow your child to sit there in the classroom and learn information that you haven't really seen or had any input or awareness or oversight of, or you remove them. But then removing a child from a peer in a group activity really puts pressure on a child and singles them out as well. So that's why it's putting a lot of pressure on parents.
Amy gives us an example to chew over.
The period conversation, I think, is relevant here because, my daughter and I have been talking. One of my books is a wonderful children's writer about books around menstrual cycle awareness and women and little boys' bodies. So we've had her books in the house since my kids were 2. So when my daughter went into lessons about periods and the menstrual cycle, we got a letter home saying this was going to come up. My daughter had learned so much more from me about natural cycles and cycles of the earth and embodiment. And the lesson she finally got at school was, you're very anatomical. This is just what happens from a very anatomical body perspective. It had missed this whole wider presentation about cycles and bodies and working with that and a lot of the women's work that we're seeing now. But that was okay with me because, by the time that she went in for her lesson, she had way more knowledge than that. And, we have conversations about that wider knowledge. With gender identity, I felt confident when she went into that talk about periods that she'd already learned a lot from me. And indeed, a small anatomical lesson about what actually happens isn't really going to make a difference. And I knew it would be presented as such, because for something to be presented in a classroom, it has to be very filtered down and, basic scientific evidence. How are you going to do that with gender identity? Are you going to open the floor for long conversations about how this fits into our society, the positives, the negatives, the conversations, what's happening? Or are you going to keep it as a very, very basic scientific lesson, in which case then that means that the conversation then just happens in the playground?
There's this book called Hold On to Your Kids, Why Parents Need to Matter More Than Peers, written by a couple of Canadian doctors. Now, I'm not endorsing it because I've pretty well only skimmed over it. But Amy's point about conversation beyond basics, happening instead in the playground, reminded me of the move from parent-centered direction to the way kids look to their peers for direction, for their values, their identity, and codes of behaviour. We now take it for granted that children care less about their parents and teachers' opinions of them and way more about their peers. Own-age kids raising one another is a common situation. Not for everyone, of course, but it's a strong trend, nonetheless. Here's Jane again.
I feel so passionate about this subject. I'm sure your audience and you understand from how I speak about it. But for me, I'm a lawyer by training. For me, these things matter terribly. I've had to step in as a parent in the role of ally. I've had to fight so many battles. My children are not just gender fluid or gender variant. They also are autistic. So they've already had to suffer a lot at the hands of school through their autism and their challenges. And then this is just another level.
Yeah.
So I've not had the luxury of being a parent who can rest on their laurels and have rosy glasses and think that everything's okay, and that every single teacher is always well-meaning and always do their best and everything's fine. In fact, sadly, in my experience, nothing's been fine.
I asked Jane this. How did the children navigate this then?
Well, at least they have one parent who's an ally.
Yes.
And I will say some of these children don't even have that out there. When I see the resistance that the fathers of my children had to even the diagnosis of autism in my kids, that was shocking. They didn't want their kids to be autistic, so let's pretend they're not. And that's very, very common. or they didn't want their kids to be gay or trans or whatever, or non-binary. So let's pretend it's not happening. So I will say, no, of course, they have huge challenges, but at least they have one person in their camp. And I'm going to say, for those kids who don't have a parent in their camp, can we please invite the bigger community to be there for them? And that can be in schools very often.
Final words in this, if this, then that segment go to Virginia when she talks about the consequence of schools teaching about gender identity and sexual orientation.
We're going to end up with a more curious and compassionate and inclusive childhood, more equipped and more understanding that those things exist. That's facts. And they deserve the same life experiences than the rest of us. And it will take away the fear. And fear is huge in shaping the life experiences of everybody. So it will take away the fear.
Let's sum things up, shall we? Now, Amy sees school as a place for teaching life skills that don't include gender identity and sexual orientation as a focus. She wants this information left for her to share with her children, and in many ways argues that the depth she will offer them will go well beyond the basics teachers can give. She queries what will be taught and the manner in which it will be delivered. Now, Jane grapples with schools in her advocacy for her neurodiverse and gender variant children. She's passionate in her commitment to gender identity and sexual orientation teachings being offered at school. The positive outcomes of teaching these topics in schools far outweigh the difficulties in approaches to delivering these topics to pupils. Now, Virginia is all in on compassion and inclusivity as core values for schools to actively teach about as they move away from the heteronormative model. She's a vote for an integrated and incremental approach on these topics within schools. Building awareness to bust people's fears is a major focus for her. And that brings us to the next segment. What's the one habit guests have because of their opinion on this topic? Our beliefs influence our behaviour and determine our actions. I mean, what habits come from my guests' beliefs? Here's me asking Jane. So what is the one habit you have? I mean, I'm sure you have lots of habits, but what's the nub of a habit that you have because of your opinion on this topic?
I give my children complete freedom to express themselves exactly the way they want.
Ooh, what does that mean? That could be anything.
They wear what they want, they present as they want, and I suppose the habit is asking them rather than make assumptions about them. Mm-hmm. What is it that you want? Who do you think you are? How do you want to present? How do you want me to support you? What pronouns do you want me to use for you? What name do you want me to use for you? Rather than thinking that I know everything about my child. In fact, I've been surprised with all my children, how much they knew who they were from very young, how much wisdom they already had. And I've educated my children more as a learning assistant than someone who is there to tell them what to think, that I know better than them. I know some things, but there's a lot of things they've taught me. So it's more of a collaboration and a dance and a partnership and a respectful partnership. You know, I would never assume that my child would not know something about them that I do. They're their own experts about themselves.
What would you say to people that say children are too young to truly be in a position to have maturity of choice?
Of course, they have their brains are not mature. And so you have to put all that sort of, safeguarding around that, make sure that they keep themselves safe. Of course, they'll want to eat sweets instead of vegetables. And you need to be the parent that guides them to look after themselves well. But other than that, there's certain things that they know better than we do. And we're here to listen rather than to impose our views or make assumptions. That's my stance. That's the habit I have.
Sounds like it encompasses everything apart from food.
Well, safety generally and health and it's come to that point. And I've been heavily criticized for it.
Have you?
Yeah.
By whom?
Relatives, mostly relatives, yeah. Sometimes friends. They're not friends anymore.
Let's hear what Virginia's one habit is, shall we?
So my habit is I treat everybody as bisexual until proven contrary, because I think everybody benefits from it. I think everybody benefits from the vast space that it causes. Then, nobody has too much space, and then they can be whoever they want, and they'll be treated as and loved and respected.
I was curious how Virginia goes about treating everybody as bisexual, so I asked her for help understanding this.
I just listen, as in if somebody tells me, oh, I'm gay, then that's it. Okay, well, you're gay, I listened. Or somebody's straight and they tell me, oh no, I just like men or just like women, and then I know. But what I'm saying is, like, I assume that everybody's bisexual, because within bisexuality, everyone fits. And then I just listen if somebody's not. But and again, I do that especially with people, with children and with teenagers, or I just don't assume that they're going to be. I don't assume my kids are going to be straight. I don't know who they're going to be. Maybe they are sexual. I don't know. I just don't assume. And that gives them so much space to be who they are and to explore their own sexuality and their own experience within the feeling that has been already decided for them. And I want to give that again to every children and every person going through and every adult as well. But yeah, I think it's very important, especially in those spaces of, trying to get some of the big pieces of the puzzle of who you are.
You just mentioned asexuality there. Where does that fit into schools teaching about gender identity and sexual orientation?
Well, I think it has to be mentioned as well. I think whenever you're teaching kids about the different sexual orientations, you have to tell them that there's people that feel unattracted either romantically or sexually to other people. There's people that are aromantic, or people that are, romantically attracted to others, but not sexually attracted to them.
I'm wondering if asexuality is taught about as a sexual orientation routinely. I'm curious, and I don't have answers.
And again, it's very beautiful to see how this is becoming part of the conversation in the media stream and in social media. And because it must be extremely confusing as an asexual person in a world that, venerates romantic and sexual relationships over everything. And just feeling like, why I don't feel like that, and that's not who I am, and what is wrong with me. I think the piece of in a world in which they've told us specifically who we are supposed to be when we're not that people, then what is wrong with me? What am I doing wrong? And the loneliness that comes from it. So I think knowing that is a thing, and there are others than you, and that's totally okay, must feel extremely freeing. So why can't we not give that to people? I mean, it doesn't take away from anyone else. So yeah, I think it should be openly discussed in an age-appropriate way when the time comes as another sexual orientation.
So far, my guests' habits include either giving their children complete freedom to express themselves as they want, and also to apply the principle in life that everyone is bisexual until they prove otherwise. I'm on the edge of my seat, wondering what Amy's habit is.
The one habit I have, which is slightly ironic for a podcast guest talking about this, is to not really talk about this. So I talk a lot about women's health. I try and stay very clear and out of discussions about gender identity unless it comes across my desk in terms of a work-related situation or a question from my children. But because it's such a heated topic, it's a bit like conversations around Brexit. It was best to sort of not try and bring it on unless you had to, because really, what's the point?
So your habit is being stum.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where I try not to bring it up unless, like Brexit, who brings up Brexit in a conversation with people unless they want to get into a heated debate about different people's views about it.
Yeah.
That's my experience of gender identity. Everyone has different views, and it's therefore ironic for a podcast guest talking about it. I try not to talk about it.
But that's deeply honest, because, you'd rather not be talking about it. Except Amy is talking about it. I've a feeling she's about to spill something.
The trouble is if you make something so polarizing, then actually everyone loses. I mean, the Brexit debate, everyone lost because no one could have a sensible discussion about what different people's viewpoints were and why. I mean, I'll never forget reading, I think it was Alex Campbell's diary, where he was talking about Tony Blair negotiating the Northern Ireland deal, was that both sides couldn't agree about anything. So they found one thing that they could agree about, and then they built from there. And I think the one thing they could agree about was something like mundane, like what they were going to have for lunch. But you find one thing, I mean, don't quote me on that, but you find one small thing and you build out and you listen and you understand. And through listening and understanding, you change your own viewpoint. Or the other person changes their own viewpoint, but you can actually meet a situation with understanding and thought. If it's polarized, you can't. And unfortunately, I think gender identity and the discussion about that, especially trans women and where women sit in this, has become polarized and angry.
And that doesn't help our children.
No, it doesn't. And that is about, the Hate Crime Act that the Scottish Government put out. The challenge on that was that protected characteristics, biological sex and women being, women around the world being a group that have not done well out of patriarchy. We've had a discussion about women's bodies, gender pay gap. It is a group that is second rate in society compared to men. So the Hate Crime Act supported the protected characteristics of intersex and trans, but didn't afford those same protections to women. So to me, in the schoolroom, it's about teaching about all groups and about supporting all, not just picking out specific ones. I think had that hate crime bill included women or biological sex, those one or two words in the bill, there would have been a very, very different outcome. It's a debate that we're not having.
One of the reasons I rebranded from the School for Mothers interview podcast to what we now know as Parents Who Think was to find ways to bridge conversation on polarising topics, to hear real parents talk about incendiary topics. So often, we think we know how those people with opinions different than our own think. And it's easy to distance ourselves from their humanity because we can make them into disembodied voices to disagree with. I speak, by the way, myself as a fallible human being who has done that. And along the way, I speak with scores of people who do this as I research debate topics for this show.
It's the and. Can you be for women and for trans? Yes. Can you, with the and in the Brexit discussion, it's either you're either for or against. It's polarized. We've lost the ability to discuss the and. And the trouble is then people do things in their own way, or the loudest voice wins, or the one with most force wins, or the school does it independently. And I don't think that's a win for anybody, really. I'm very clear that I'm pro-women and I'm pro-trans. It's not one or the other. But that's the trouble. It's become polarized. If you stand up for women, you're a TERF. You're anti-trans. It's like, no, you can be both.
As Amy shared, her habit is to keep quiet, to not say that she's an and, because that doesn't seem to be an admissible position to hold. Remember, she also feels her opinion is a predictable one. That's her analysis. In episode 1, I dish the dirt on my relationship with being taught about gender identity and sexual orientation at school and at home. You've also heard from my son, who I shared a little about too. I promised I'd circle back in this episode and say what my thoughts are on schools teaching about gender identity and sexual orientation to my kids in this Last Words segment. So here we are. Now, if you're a regular listener, you'll know that my youngest, boy-girl, boy triplets, are home educated. My oldest 7 children were educated in schools, and the triplets have been to school. I have a great deal of experience of school systems, both in the state and independent sector in the UK. I want to contextualise my thoughts on this debate. This is a schools-based debate, and my triplets are not in school. One has an education health care plan, EHCP, and complex additional needs that have not to date, been able to be met in any school setting. The official way I describe this child's educational status is that I involuntarily home educate him. I didn't choose to home educate him. After several attempts in schools with multiple one-to-ones, his last head and I mutually agreed the setting was traumatic for him. Now, it's 3 years since that moment. My local authority has not offered him any school or alternative provision. And that's a whole other story. Another triplet is also special needs, and the level of support offered could never help to support her. In the end, it meant splitting them up with 2 at home and 1 in school. I mean, the obvious choice was surrender to home education for all. Given the appalling track record I've experienced in the past few years of needs not being met, kids enduring traumatic situations, and witnessing the level of bullying in schools, I've got to acknowledge how much this colours my answer to the debate question. That's the backcloth. It affects my answer immeasurably. Should schools teach about gender identity and sexual orientation? My friends will assume I'd say an outright, unequivocal yes. They'd be right that I'm an advocate for inclusive, non-heteronormative models of living. In the past, I fought for my gender-questioning children in their schools when they faced discrimination, bullying, and ignorance. It's because of the conditions in schools that I'm sad to say that I now have zero confidence that schools approach this teaching in intelligent and thoughtful ways. I can't allow myself to be naive to imagine that this teaching curriculum is positive or even neutral. Thing is, I wouldn't want it to be neutral. I'd want it to be celebratory of difference, to ally with people who question their gender and sexual orientation and who want to transition. But the school curriculum in the UK is created by the Secretary of State for Education, also known as the government. And I'm wondering when the government became progressive. After all, let's question this. For example, how many trans MPs are represented in the government right now, today? Look this up and then tell me that you're wholly confident about the content disseminated in schools on this topic. Now, this month, April 2024, a paper was published by the University of Birmingham, authored by Dr. Sophie King-Hill. Now, this report outlines feedback from a number of steering groups of young people in response to relationship, sex and health education. That's RSHE, which is obviously what we're looking at. Now, the findings are stark. I'll link to this report for you in the episode show notes. Young people themselves answered robust research questions about the state of gender identity and sexual orientation teachings across the UK. It's their voice that I prefer to listen to when I consider whether I feel schools are the places to teach this. Let me be clear, if the findings from this report were different, then I'd maybe say yes, schools should teach about this. I'm just not convinced that schools have capacity to do this under current pressures. Many teachers try so hard, but the system is a mess. That's a huge generalisation, well beyond the scope of this debate, and I know it. So what did young people say in this report? Let me just share a few bits for you. They said that RHSE was delivered in ways that made them passive learners, not active participants in the process. They concluded it was boring. They said that RSHE is one-sided. They were told what they can and can't do in relation to sex and relationships, but little consideration was given to their own specific and contextual needs and experiences, i.e., were they listened to? They felt that there was a large element of shame to RSHE, which didn't help learning and reinforced the position that sex is something to be embarrassed about. Ugh. The importance of the educator can't be underestimated. Successful and effective RSHE depends so much on the skills, knowledge and approach of the teacher. Young people talked about a lack of confident teachers, overly instructional teaching styles, awkward teachers, and lack of inclusion of pupils' ideas and contributions within the teaching itself. Young people pointed to sexism in the teaching. Now, let me give you an example of that. Teaching about, only teaching about male masturbation, not female masturbation, and framing boys as perpetrators and girls as victims without further explorations of the nuances of the issue of violence against women and girls. Young people also highlighted that boys and girls were often split to learn about different aspects of RSHE, and that this was counterproductive and divides and reinforces gender as binary. I mean, please, what are we doing splitting genders? And what do you do with pupils, who don't want to be in a boy or girl gender? These are just some of the issues young people raised about current teaching practices. Now, they clearly don't represent all viewpoints and experiences of schools teaching about gender identity and sexual orientation. They're enough for me, though. They really are. If my children were in schools, I'd be one of the parents asking to see content. That's right, I'd be one of those parents. I'd not want to give main responsibility for this teaching to schools as cultural transmitters, and instead, I'd want to partner with the school to bring together training for all. I believe that where budgets allow, training on gender identity and sexual orientation could start with parents. A campaign to teach parents would be effective in educating families at root source, rather than handing this to schools who neither have resources or capacity to deliver it. Teachers and school principals need training. Kids need teaching, but it needs to be a 360 approach. Landing this in the hands of teachers could be said to be a cop-out when they're already stretched to the absolute limit. No matter where children get an education, parents are in charge of that education, not the school, not the administration. Parents are in charge of it. And many of us forget that. We go, okay, my kids are at school, they're in the school's hands now. But that's not the case. If my children were in school, I'd be saying we are all in this together, in partnership with one another. But my kids aren't in schools, for good reasons. Parents are certainly not perfect educators on these sensitive and crucial topics, which is why a modest program of adult education could improve our abilities even more to educate ourselves and our children about diversity, inclusivity, and respect for all individuals. What my three guests and I show is how fraught this topic is and how vulnerable it is to openly discuss it. All the more so if we air the contradictions and contrasts of how we think about it. But that's the thing. We're not talking right and wrong, bad and good. These are yet more versions of binary ways of thinking, which is what we're talking about. It's one thing knowing about all this in theory, but another hearing messy opinions from the inside of people's heads and hearts. That takes compassion to embrace and to allow in ourselves and in others. I'm wondering what you learned by hearing four parents tell you about our relationship to schools teaching about gender identity and sexual orientation. Where has this debate left you as you think about your own education on this and what you think about schools teaching on it? I hope you found this tough debate thought-provoking and that it triggers conversation in your home, among your friends, and maybe in your school. Let's close this should schools teach about gender identity and sexual orientation debate with some final words from my wonderful guests, Virginia, Amy, and Jane.
I think schools should teach about diversity, about inclusion, about the power of being ourselves, about the importance of being compassionate, about why nobody wins when we stay in our boxes. And I think more than teaching those things, which I hardly believe that they should, I think they mostly should model it. I think those things should be just part of the DNA of the schools. I think the schools should just be, inclusive and aware of the importance of these topics. And I'm talking about gender equality as well. I think it's very important that the schools teach about gender equality to kids, but I think it's most important that they model it.
So a life skill, I believe, is accepting and respecting people for who they are. You can do that in a much broader way without really pinning down into the specifics of gender identity. Teaching our children in the classroom how to respect and understand the variety of humans, I think, is a more effective way than actually honing in on a specific such as gender identity, when, disability, race, the role of women, all of these different things are other aspects of identity that would need to be covered in the same detail.
Why can't we embrace sexuality as something healthy, no matter how it's expressed? Obviously, there has to be some boundaries, Adults with children, it's a big no-no. Consent, super important, but stop being ashamed of your sexuality. Gender and even sexual orientation, from what I've discussed with my friends and people I've met, because I meet a lot more of the people in the LGBT community because I'm an ally, they all say they knew from very young. And one of my children, from the moment they were able to speak, told me they were of a gender that was not the gender they were assigned at birth. The relief that a trans person experience, I haven't experienced it personally, but I've seen it. When someone tells them it's not abnormal for you to feel that you're a different gender than the one that you were assigned at birth. It's not as uncommon as you think, and there's nothing wrong with you. That can be life-saving.
I'm so glad you were here for this PWT debate. Now, our next debate comes out in a couple of weeks. I'll feature 3 more parents who will share their opinions on another hot topic. As I said already, we'll be debating should smacking be banned in England and Northern Ireland. I hope you'll join us for that. If you'd like to react in some way to something you heard, I encourage you to come join the Parents Who Think Substack community. Pop the words Parents Who Think Substack into your search engine and it'll come up. Or come on over to our new YouTube page, funnily enough, called Parents Who Think. Thanks for being such a great supporter of the show, and tune in next time for more valuable conversation from PWT. Take care, everyone.